Thank you. Thanks. Hi there. Thanks for coming today. As I was listening to Leanne's introduction, standing backstage there, I thought, who's this interesting guy? I can't wait to see what he has to say with all these prizes behind him. I'm going to kind of frame my reading, and I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But first, I just want to start with a poem that's outside the frame and unrelated, but it's a poem. It's all about teaching. Well, underneath is bubbling something about teaching a lot of poetry workshops and getting really tired of doing that. But you'll see. It's a poem called Silence. Now it is time to say what you have to say. The room is quiet. The whirring fan has been unplugged, and the girl who was tapping a pencil on her desktop has been removed. So tell us what is on your mind. We want to hear the sound of your foliage, the unraveling of your toolkit, your songs of loneliness, your songs of hurt. The trains are motionless on the tracks, the ships at rest in the harbor, the dogs are cocking their heads, and the gods are peering down from their balloons. The town is hushed, and everyone here has a copy. So tell us about your parents, your father behind the steering wheel, your cruel mother at the sink. Let's hear about all the clouds you saw, all the trees. Read the poem you brought with you tonight. The ocean has stopped sloshing around, and even Beethoven is sitting up in his deathbed, and his hearing horn, that cold trumpet, inserted into one ear. Okay, so get that out of the way, and I'm going to be more cheery from here on. So the way I want to frame this, often I just have a playlist here, and I kind of check poems off that I want to read, and I do that, but I want to give a reading that is kind of correcting an image that I have, or at least my persona has, and that is that my persona doesn't get out much. Many of my poems kind of take place in a domestic setting, or my persona is looking out the window, but he really has trouble getting out the door in a lot of these poems. He's almost too sensitive to go outside. And in one review, they called me an indoor nature poet. And I must say, it's a reputation that I admit to have cultivated. One of the titles of my books is Sailing Alone Around the Room, so that doesn't help. And on the cover is a windowless interior by Joshua Reynolds. And let me give you a couple of examples of how I have kind of cultivated that image. This is a poem called Budapest. Now that's a kind of promising title, but in terms of getting out of the house, but hang on. Budapest. And I tried, in other words, in this poem, or not in other words, but in these words, in this poem, I'm trying to make the act of writing almost something that's unconscious, that's done without even me being conscious of it. Budapest. My pen moves along the page like the snout of a strange animal, an anteater maybe, shaped like a human arm and dressed in the sleeve of a loose green sweater. I watch it sniffing the paper ceaselessly, intent as any forager that has nothing on its mind but the grubs and insects that will allow it to live another day. It wants only to be here tomorrow, dressed perhaps in the sleeve of a plaid shirt, nose pressed against the page, writing a few more dutiful lines, while I gaze out the window and imagine Budapest or some other city where I have never been. So that is, and here's another one. Now, most of these readings are going to be, it's kind of travel log, but I just want to give you some examples of how this reputation is partially my fault, or my doing, really. So here's a poem called Fishing on the Susquehanna in July. Also, you'd think a pretty promising title, right? Fishing on the Susquehanna in July. I have never been fishing on the Susquehanna, or any river for that matter, to be perfectly honest. Not in July or any month have I had the pleasure, if it is a pleasure, of fishing on the Susquehanna. I am more likely to be found in a quiet room like this one, a painting of a woman on the wall, a bowl of tangerines on the table, trying to manufacture the sensation of fishing on the Susquehanna. There is little doubt that others have been fishing on the Susquehanna, rowing upstream in a wooden boat, sliding the oars under the water, then raising them to drip in the light. But the nearest I have ever come to fishing on the Susquehanna was one afternoon in a museum in Philadelphia, when I balanced the little egg of time in front of a painting in which that river curled around a bend under a blue cloud-ruffled sky, dense trees along the banks, and a fellow with a red bandana sitting in a small green flat-bottomed boat holding the thin whip of a pole. That is something I am unlikely ever to do, I remember saying to myself and the person next to me. Then I blinked and moved on to other American paintings of haystacks, water whitening over rocks, even one of a brown hare who seemed so wired with alertness, I imagined him springing right out of the frame. So there he'd rather be in a museum than actually on the river. I'll give you one more. And this is a poem, excuse me, a poem in which he basically renounces traveling, repudiates it even. It's called Safe Travels. Oh, do you know what a snood is? I didn't until recently. A snood is a kind of a knitted pouch that women used to hold their hair in ages ago. And it's a very old-fashioned thing these days. That's why we probably don't know what snood is. But it's been adopted by a lot of hipsters in New York and Brooklyn, a lot of guys who walk around with their hair kind of bundled up in these snoods. And I have a feeling if they knew it was called a snood, they wouldn't wear them so much. And I always, if I pass one, I just kind of mumble under my breath, nice snood there, pal. Anyway, it's just one word that comes in at the end. And the poem is called Safe Travels. Every time Gulliver travels into another chapter of Gulliver Travels, I marvel at how well-traveled he is, despite his incurable gullibility. I don't enjoy traveling anymore because, for instance, I don't know the difference between a bloke and a chap. And I'm embarrassed whenever I have to hold out a palm of loose coins to a cashier as if I were feeding a pigeon in the park. Like Proust, I see only trouble in store if I leave my room, which is not lined with cork, only sheets of wallpaper featuring orange flowers and little green vines. Of course, anytime I want, I can travel in my imagination, but only as far as Toronto, where some graduate students with goatees and snoods are translating my poems into Canadian. So that is the complete renunciation of that. And then the other thing is when, on occasion, when this character, this persona, who is very much like me, but not exactly, when he does travel a little bit, when he gets out of the house and kicks around, he gets very easily distracted by little things that, and he misses the big picture. And this is a poem called Hotel, it's very short, Hotel Rex. Looming over the little sewing kit and the miniature bottles of shampoo and conditioner, I am a giant, a king standing before the royal mirror in an enormous robe of terry cloth. As a sign of my benevolence, I will forego coffee and the morning paper from room service and check out early before my tiny subjects arrive to wash their hair and mend their simple attire. Or, if he's not distracted in these odd ways, he's unhappy because he is pathetically trying to fit in, and he fails to. So this is an example of that. The poem is called I Am Not Italian. I am not Italian, technically speaking. Yet here I am leaning on a zinc bar in Florence on a sunny weekday morning, my foot up on the iron railing, just like the other men who, it must be said, are officially and completely Italian. It's 8:40 and they are off to work, some in offices, others sweeping the streets, while I am off to a museum or a church to see paintings, maybe light a candle in an alcove. Yet here we all are in our suits and work shirts, joined in the brotherhood of espresso, or how is it said, la fraternelza dell'espresso, draining our little white cups with a quick flourish of the wrist, each of us tasting the same sweetness of life, if you take a little sugar, and the bitterness of its brevity, whether you choose to take sugar or not. So we've discovered he's not Italian. We kind of suspected that earlier. But he, occasionally he gets drawn in, and so here's a couple of examples of he is moved by his travels, by something in his travels to a condition of focus and appreciation. And this poem is called Elk River Falls. It's a falls in Idaho. So he's gotten as far as Idaho. Elk River Falls. Elk River, I should just say that since you don't have the poem in front of you, it's all one stanza and it's all one sentence, because I'm trying to follow the course of the falls and the river that it turns into. And of course, a river and waterfalls don't have stanzas or sentences, or they're continuous. Elk River Falls. Elk River Falls is where the Elk River falls from a rocky and considerable height, turning pale with trepidation at the lip, it seemed from where I stood below, before it unbuckles from itself and plummets, shredded through the air, into the shadows of a frigid pool, so calm around the edges, a place for water to recover from the shock of falling apart and coming back together, before it picks up its song again, goes gliding around some massive rocks and past some islands overgrown with weeds, then flattens out, slips around a bend, and continues on its winding course, according to this camper's guide, then joins the Clearwater at its northern fork, which leads it all to the distant sea, where this and every other stream mistakes the monster for itself, sings its name one final time, then feels the sudden sting of salt. That's sort of a sad end for a river, but I guess that's the way it's set up here. And here's a poem about, it's called Canada, and my mother was Canadian, and I spent a lot of time there as a child, which was much appreciated because we lived in the middle of New York City, and so getting out into the extreme country in northern Ontario was great for me as a kid. I mentioned sweet caprals. Sweet caprals are an extinct brand of Canadian cigarette. I don't know why they're called that. Also, although my speaker, I keep detaching myself from him, as you'll notice, but although he's in Canada, he gets very distracted by something in the poem. Canada. I am writing this on a strip of white birch bark that I cut from a tree with a penknife. There is no other way to adequately express the immensity of the clouds that are passing over the farms and wooded lakes of Ontario, and the endless visibility that hands you the horizon on a platter. I am also writing this in a wooden canoe, a point of balance in the middle of Lake Couchiching, resting the birch bark against my knees. I can feel the sun's hands on my bare back, but I am thinking of winter, snow piled up in all the provinces, and the solemnity of the long grain ships that pass the cold months moored at Owen Sound. O Canada, as the anthem goes, scene of my boyhood summers, you are the pack of sweet caprils on the table. You are the dove-soft train whistle in the night. You are the empty chair at the end of an empty dock. You are the shelves of books in a lakeside cottage, gift from the sea by Anne Morrow Lindbergh, A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson, Anne of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery, So You're Going to Paris by Clara E. Lawton, and Peril Over the Airport, one of the Vicky Barr Flight Stewardess series by Helen Wells, whom some will remember as the author of the Cherry Ames nurse stories. What has become of the languorous girls who had passed the long summer evenings reading Cherry Ames student nurse, Cherry Ames senior nurse, Cherry Ames chief nurse, Cherry Ames flight nurse? Where are they now, the ones who shared her adventures as a veterans nurse, private duty nurse, visiting nurse, cruise nurse, night supervisor, mountaineering nurse, dude ranch nurse? There is little she has not done. Rest home nurse, department store nurse, boarding school nurse, and country doctor's nurse. O Canada, I have not forgotten you. And as I kneel in my canoe, beholding this vision of a bookcase, I pray that I remain in your vast polar North American heart and memory. You are the paddle, the snowshoe, the cabin in the pines. You are Jean de Brébeuf with his martyr's necklace of hatchet heads. You are the moose in the clearing and the moose head on the wall. You are the rapids, the propellers, the kerosene lamp. You are the dust that coats the roadside berries. But not only that, you are the two boys with pails walking along that road, and one of them, the taller one, minus the straw hat, is me. Well, the other, a lot of travel ends, as you know, in disappointment. The travel writers, one thing they never tell you is how bored you're going to be when you get there. And my speaker is ready to be bored. And this is about, the trouble with this journey is it's a journey to Palermo, Italy, which is the big city in Sicily. And the trouble with that is that we went in August, which is insanely hot. I mean, it's like 40 degrees centigrade. So it's really about the way heat, extreme heat, can distort perception and even become kind of hallucinatory. Palermo. It was foolish of us to leave our room. The empty plaza was shimmering. The clock looked ready to melt. The heat was a mallet striking a ball and sending it bouncing into the nettles of summer. Even the bees had knocked off for the day. The only thing that was moving besides us, and we had since stopped under an awning, was a squirrel who was darting this way and that, as if he were having second thoughts about crossing the empty street, his head and tail twitching with indecision. You were looking in a shop window, but I was watching the squirrel, who now rose up on his hind legs, and after pausing to look in all directions, began to sing in a beautiful voice, a melancholy aria about life and death, his forepaws clutched against his chest, his face full of longing and hope as the sun beat down on the roofs and awnings of the city, and the earth continued to turn and hold in position the moon, which would appear later that night as we sat in a cafe, and I stood up on the table with the encouragement of the owner and sang for you and all the others the song the squirrel had taught me how to sing. So that's almost true, entirely. And then photographing the whole thing is often a problem. And not only are you not quite there since you're busy photographing and the camera is standing between you and whatever you're trying to photograph, but often something else is standing between you and the thing you're trying to photograph. And this is called the unfortunate traveler. Because I was off to France, I packed my camera along with my shaving kit, some colorful boxer shorts, and a sweater with a zipper. But every time I tried to take a picture of a bridge, a famous plaza, or the bronze equestrian statue of a general, there was a woman standing in front of me, taking a picture of the very same thing, or the odd pedestrian blocking my view, or someone or something always getting between me and the flying buttress, the riverboat, the bright cafe awning, the unexpected pillar. So into the little door of the lens came not the kiosk or the altarpiece, no fresco or baptistry slipped by the quick shutter. Instead, my memories of that glorious summer of my youth are awakened now like an ember fanned into brightness by the shoulder, the back of a raincoat, a wide hat, or towering hairdo, lost time miraculously recovered by the buttons on a gendarme's coat, and my very favorite, the palm of that vigilant guard at the Louvre. So, and of course, something else can happen when you travel, which is disorientation. Malcolm Lowry, who was quite a traveler himself, actually, but he said traveling to another country was leaving an environment to which you bore little relationship and trading that into an environment to which you bear no relationship whatsoever. And this is a poem called Basho in Ireland. Now, Basho was a 17th century Japanese haiku poet, one of the big guns of haiku poetry. So he wouldn't be in Ireland, but here he is. Basho in Ireland. It would be like St. Peter in China or something. Basho in Ireland. I am like the Japanese poet who longed to be in Kyoto even though he was already in Kyoto. But I am not exactly like him because I am not Japanese, and I have no idea what Kyoto is like. But once, while walking around the Irish town of Ballyvaughan, I caught myself longing to be in Ballyvaughan. The sensation of being homesick for a place that is not my home while being right in the middle of it was particularly strong when I passed the hotel bar, then the fluorescent depth of a laundrette. Also when I stood at the crossroads with the roadsides signs pointing in three directions, in the enormous buses making the turn. It might have something to do with the nearby limestone hills and the rain collecting on my collar, but then again, I have longed to be with a number of people while the two of us were sitting in the same room on an ordinary evening without a limestone hill in sight, thousands of miles from Kyoto, in the simple pleasures of Ballyvaughan. Which reminds me of another Japanese poet, which reminds me of another Japanese poet who wrote how much he enjoyed not being able to see his favorite mountain because of all the fog. But then there are, I would say, epiphanies. There are transformative experiences that these poems include. And this one is, again, we go back to Ireland. I think last night, Randy, my friend Randy, my new best friend Randy, was describing how when he was younger and he'd go to a foreign country, he was rather amazed that the signs and the billboards were in another language. And I never found that surprising for some reason or other. But what I did find surprising was thinking that the animals, like the birds and the dogs and the cows or whatever, were, French or Italian or something like that. So this is called Afternoon with Irish Cows. And the other thing this shows is that I have the wrong book. The other thing this shows is that, as I mentioned, I grew up in New York City, so I had very little experience with cows. This shows that I didn't really understand them very well. Afternoon with Irish Cows. There were a few dozen who occupied the field across the road from where we lived, stepping all day from tuft to tuft, their big heads down in the soft grass, though I would sometimes pass a window and look out to see the field suddenly empty, as if they had taken wing, flown off to another county. Then later I would open the blue front door, and again the field will be full of their munching, or they would be lying down on the black and white maps of their sides, facing in all directions, waiting for rain. How mysterious, how patient and dumbfounded they appeared in the long quiet of the afternoons. But every once in a while, one of them would let out a sound so phenomenal that I would put down the paper or the knife I was cutting an apple with and walk across the road to the stone wall to see which one of them was being torched or pierced through the side with a long spear. Yes, it sounded like pain until I could see the noisy one anchored there on all fours, her neck outstretched, her bellowing head laboring upward as she gave voice to the rising, full-bodied cry that began in the darkness of her belly and echoed up through her bowed ribs into her gaping mouth. Then I knew that she was only announcing the large, unadulterated cowness of herself, pouring out the ancient apologia of her kind to all the green fields and the gray clouds, to the limestone hills and the inlet of the blue bay, while she regarded my head and shoulders above the wall with one wild, shocking eye. See, when cows, when they look at you sideways, a lot of the white of the eye is exposed, which gives them, I would say, a kind of psychiatric look. I mean, they look just glad they don't have horns. And so that was a lesson. Here's another poem that is kind of a positive, something that wouldn't have happened without traveling. This is a poem that takes place in Mexico, and the title is the Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende. The Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende is not made up of the usual instruments. Instead of brass, strings, and woodwinds, there are church bells, roosters, doves, and barking dogs, all of which predate the horn, the violin, and the oboe, notably the rooster, who crowed even before the time of Christ. The orchestra plays all day and into the night, But the music is most vibrant in the early morning, when much of the audience is still in bed and not distracted by their jobs and errands, as they will be later in the day. At first, as I listened from my canopied bed, it sounded like a noisy riot of nonsense, until I imagined a gigantic score written centuries ago by the Mozart of Mexico, the same genius who decided that those dogs should come in just after the 32 gongs of a solemn bell, and who had the doves modulate into an adagio, and who added a rest here and there where the roosters should pause, but not for very long. Are we not seekers of order, I thought, as when we examine the lines in our palms or connect the dots of the stars to form a bear in the sky? Then why not lie here a little longer before rising from our slumber to ponder the great meaning of this composition for dogs, roosters, doves, and bells? The dogs are barking to be fed. The roosters are beckoning us to the hen house where 3 eggs are still warm in the straw. But the doves are mourning our losses, and the bells are there to remind us of God. So his eyes are capable of being opened. Here we're off to another exotic, isn't this fun? Off to another exotic travel along with Billy Collins. To another exotic location where he really does have an uplifting, revelatory, I guess is the word, experience. And it's called Istanbul, another promising title. And it's about a bath there, a Turkish bath, obviously. They don't call them Turkish baths because they're in Turkey. And it's actually, the name of it is called, it's Jalalu, and it's the oldest bathhouse in Turkey, I think, certainly in Istanbul, dating from the 18th century. So this was the experience there, Istanbul. It was a pleasure to enter by a side street in the center of the city, a bathhouse said to be 300 years old enough to have opened the pores of Florence Nightingale and soaped the musical head of Franz Liszt. And it was a pleasure to drink cold wine by a low wood fire before being directed to a small room in an upper gallery, a room with a carpet and a narrow bed, where I folded my clothes into a pile, then came down naked except for a gauzy striped cloth tucked around my waist. It was an odd and eye-opening sensation to be led by a man with close-cropped hair and spaces between his teeth into a steamy marble rotunda, and to lie there then alone on the smooth marble, watching the droplets fall from the beams of natural light in the dome, and later to hear myself singing "She Thinks I Still Care" as it echoes up into the ceiling. I felt like the last of the sultans by the time the man returned and began to scrub me and to lather and douse me, scour and shampoo me and splash my drenched body with warm, fresh water scooped from a marble basin. But it was not until he sudsed me behind my ears and between my toes that I felt myself filling with gratitude, the way a cloud fills with rain, the way a glass pipe slowly fills with smoke. In silence, I thanked the man who scrubbed the bottoms of my feet. I thanked the history of the Turkish bath and the long chain of bathmen standing unshaven, arms folded, waiting for the next customer to come through the swinging doors of frosted glass. I thanked everyone whose job it ever was to lay hands on the skin of strangers. And I gave general thanks that I was lying face down in a puddle of warm soap and not a puddle of blood in some corner of this incomprehensible city. As one bucket after another of warm water was poured over my lowered head, I stopped thinking of who and what to thank, and I rowed out on a boat of joy, a blue boat of marble and soap, rowed out to the entrance of the harbor, where I raised a finger of goodbye and felt the boat beginning to rise and fall as it met the roll of the incoming waves, bearing my body, my clean and blessed body, out to sea. So that was worth the trip. That was... and then, here's another, I think, a sort of transformative moment, or at least a moment when you're out of your element. You can get new insights, I think. You're just shaken out of your routine, and the strangeness of things often, if you stop thinking of it as totally strange, it can provoke, I think, new kinds of insights. So this is something I learned about. I mentioned, now 4 times or something, that I was brought up in New York City. But I visited a friend of mine whose name happens to be John Whale, and some of you might recognize that name from earlier references. And I would visit him in Vermont, and he would try to teach me country stuff like fly fishing and deer hunting, stuff like that. And deer hunting for me was basically getting lost with a gun. I realized when I was lost, we were going together, and then there were 2 deer tracks that diverged, and he went one way, and we went quietly, parted company, and I realized at some point I had no idea where I was. And I had an apple and a chocolate bar with me, and it was snowing lightly, and it was late in the afternoon in Vermont. And I immediately ate the apple and the chocolate bar to just comfort myself about being lost instead of wisely rationing them. But eventually I saw a guy up on a deer blind or whatever with a gun, and I made sure he didn't think I was a deer. And he pointed the way back. But anyway, this is a little point of domestic country lore that my friend John Whalen tried to teach me, and it's called The Country. I wondered about you when you told me never to leave a box of wooden strike anywhere matches just lying around the house because the mice might get into them and start a fire. But your face was absolutely straight when you twisted the lid down on the round tin where the matches you said are always stowed. Who could sleep that night? Who could whisk away the thought of the one unlikely mouse padding along a cold water pipe behind the floral wallpaper, gripping a single wooden match between the needles of his teeth? Who could not see him rounding a corner, the blue tip scratching against a rough-hewn beam, the sudden flare, and the creature, for one bright shining moment, suddenly thrust ahead of his time, now a fire starter, now a torchbearer in a forgotten ritual, little brown druid illuminating some ancient night. And who could fail to notice, lit up in the blazing insulation, the tiny looks of wonderment on the faces of his fellow mice, one-time inhabitants of what once was your house in the country. I'll do a couple more of these, and then, here's, this is a poem about, I think it's in this book, about, takes place in Greece. So you can see he's better traveled as we go along here. And it's called Santorini. It's one of the more preciously beautiful islands in all of the Greek islands. Oh, I mentioned, I guess, 3 Greek poets. So if you hear a name, well, they're Yannis Ritsos, George Seferis, and Kavafi. So there are 3 Greek poets who wrote in the past century and the one before that, not ancient. Santorini. Turn any street corner in this village, the owner of an eccentric bookstore assured me, and you are likely to run into the history of Greek poetry. And sure enough, there was a woman picking out lemons from a pile of lemons, and a barber leaning in his doorway with folded arms. I even thought I saw Yanis Ritsos whispering something to George Seferis as they sat under a white awning while the others pulled down their hat brims, pretending not to listen. And Cavafy might have risen in a room like the one where I woke up, to chalk white walls, 2 wicker chairs, and a battered table, coffee, and a single peach, newly sliced. But let us not go overboard. When I peered out the small window at the foot of the bed that offered the immensity of the Aegean, I did not see the sail of Odysseus at dawn, rounding the island's volcanic corner and coming slowly but painfully into view. Rather, I heard the hornet whine of a motorbike flying up the street, a metal grill being unlocked and lifted open, then some mourning doves on the roof, and a clatter of dishes in a kitchen, and other siren songs of an ordinary day. And then I'll just end that section with 2 poems about returning. And one is called Home Again, and you'll see that Ireland is kind of his favorite place. But it's just a poem about coming home, and they say there's no place like it. But it's always amazing if you're not living with other people to come home and see that things are pretty much the way you left them. So it's called Home Again. The black porcelain lamp, painted with boughs of cherry blossoms, still stands on its end table, unlit, and the little chain untouched, just the way I left it, just the way it remained while I was off, leaning into the prow of a boat, doused with spray, heading for a limestone island, or sitting at the base of a high Celtic cross, eating a green apple. While I balanced a pan of hot water on a stone wall and shaved outside a cottage looking over the Irish Sea, this stack of books, this chair and paperweight were utterly still, as they are now. And you, red box of matches on the floor, you waited here too, faithful as Penelope, while I saw the tiny fields disappearing under the wing of my airplane, or swam up and down the flowing Corrib River. As I lay in a meadow near Ballyvaughan, ankles crossed, arms behind my head, a neat trick. Ankles crossed, comma, arms behind my head, watching clouds as they rolled in, billowing massive Atlantic fresh. All of you held your places in these rooms, stuck to your knitting, waiting for me to stand here again, bags at my feet, house key still in hand, admiring your constancy, your silent fealty, your steadfast repose. And then one more on this line, and it's a poem called, it's about a canceled trip. And we were supposed to go to Italy for a little summer vacation, and for one reason or another, the trip had to be canceled. And so we stayed home in New York, in the suburbs of New York. And so the poem is called Consolation, because I'm trying to console myself about having missed out on this trip. Consolation. How agreeable it is not to be touring Italy this summer, wandering her cities and ascending her torrid hill towns. How much better to cruise these local familiar streets, fully grasping the meaning of every road sign and billboard, and all the sudden hand gestures of my compatriots. There are no abbeys here, no crumbling frescoes or famous domes, and there is no need to memorize a succession of kings or tour the dripping corners of a dungeon. No need to stand around a sarcophagus, see Napoleon's little bed on Elba, or view the bones of a saint under glass? How much better to command the simple precinct of home than be dwarfed by pillar, arch, and basilica? Why hide my head in phrase books and wrinkled maps? Why feed scenery into a hungry, one-eyed camera, eager to eat the world, one monument at a time? Instead of slouching in a cafe, ignorant of the word for ice, I will head down to the coffee shop and the waitress known as Dot. I will slide into the flow of the morning paper, all language barriers down, rivers of idiom running freely, eggs over easy on the way. And after breakfast, I will not have to find someone willing to photograph me with my arm around the owner. I will not puzzle over the bill or record in a journal what I had to eat and how the sun came in the window. It is enough to climb back into the car as if it were the great car of English itself, and sounding my loud vernacular horn, speed off down a road that will never lead to Rome, not even Bologna. And so I think that kind of, well, I'll read one tiny poem, which it's actually a little rhyming poem. And I don't know if you know, it's in this book, Amy Mann, the singer, she set this to music and made it very dark, because she's a dark singer, but and it's called France. Because I haven't talked about the possibilities of romance while traveling. France, you and your frozen banana, you and your creme brulee, can't we just skip dessert and go back to the Hotel d'Orsay? You and your apple tart and your plate of profiteroles, can't we just ask for the check? Can't you hear time's mortal call? Why linger here at the table, stuffing ourselves with sweets, when all the true pleasures await us in room 348? So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.